Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Adolescent Development Substance Use Current Trends. And this presentation is brought to you by the Northeast Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. And my name is Diane Padilla, and I am the host and presenter this morning. So thanks, everyone, for being here. And this is a SAMHSA disclaimer. You folks have seen this before. We're funded by them. And most of our content and our initiatives are majorly focused on the addiction discipline, but we also work with the ancillary partners because there's such intersectionality when it comes to this work. The purpose of SAMHSA's TTCs is to provide specialized behavioral healthcare and primary healthcare workforce supports in terms of substance use disorder, mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery. This is about providing you the most innovative information and ways to incorporate effective practices into your settings. So we have 10 regional centers. We are across the country. We are a free resource. That's us right there, Region 2. You see the big, beautiful yellow state of New York. We also cover the state of New Jersey, and we partner with our colleagues in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands to provide support there. So this is the TTC umbrella. And so we have the three, SAMHSA provides a response for support to addiction, mental health, and prevention. So virtual platform logistics. For WebEx, we are a little bit more limited in terms of interactivity, but we do have that capability. So it is feasible for us to communicate with one another through the chat box and for you to support one another through the chat box. And sometimes what happens is you are aware of certain resources that are available and you can share them in the chat box, which is really great. That's a wonderful thing that we have about presentations, webinars, and workshops in trainings, whether it's virtual and in person, is that we can network and we can offer each other resources that one another that we may not be aware of. And there are times also that I may ask you questions, or bring up an issue and then ask you if, to respond in the chat box. Connectivity issues. One of the best ways to keep us a stable internet signal is to be connected directly to the router with an Ethernet cable. And so if you could do that, that'd be great. If you are on wireless, then you should be, I suggest that you be in an area where the signal rarely falls. So, and that'll help you, but the Ethernet cable is kind of the best way to go. So what's our goal today? I want to provide you with a review of mental health correlates of teenage stress and substance use. And we want to use a COVID lens, so to speak. So we want to understand the context of what social distancing can be doing or impacting our youth today, and essentially really just trying to speak about how different life stressors can affect adolescents and incur or have adverse consequences such as substance use, mental health, or co-occurring disorders, and strategies and effective approaches to be able to address these with. So some of the common adolescent problems that we see today have to do with growth and development. It is not always the most prevalent information that youth or teenagers get, where they understand that they have a development process, that there are stages they go through, that there are certain tasks that they are naturally going to, engage in. They don't typically have that information. I do know that sometimes when we can provide information to our youth or what some of the things are happening, just like when we do with they're changing bodies, when they go through puberty. When they go through puberty stages, then you may want it helps them to know what's going on. So it's the same thing with their psychological and cognitive developments. It helps them to understand if you let them know what it is that is, what their processes are and what they're involved in. Some of the other issues that we do see today, some of the other issues are school-related challenges. Sometimes we are able to have some observable markers on on when, can you all hear me now? Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. So some school-related challenges that are pretty common among adolescents have to a lot to do with social interactions, learning those skills, learning how while they are going through identity formation, while they're trying to understand and learn who they are, and they are aligning themselves with peers and working within, being accepted within peer groups, within certain groups, and then being able to practice, how to interact with one another, how to behave, what to do, what not to do. It's kind of tough being a kid. It really is tough being an adolescent. And sometimes in school related, the school environment, it's the opportunity to build skills, but it's also the place where you're going to have the most challenges. For many of our adolescents. Also, we have illnesses that continue into from childhood to adolescence and even into adulthood. Mental health disorders, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Consequences of risky and illegal behaviors. And if any of you were on the webinar a couple of days ago, we started to speak to some of the developmental stages that are neurologically connected. They're correlated with certain levels of development in the brain and how certain functions are actually evolving. And so there are a lot that goes on in terms of risky behaviors and that experimental stage with adolescents. And we understand today that a lot of it has to do with part of the mind that is only has a better, more fuller capacity to be more emotionally set than it is to have a fully developed brain where you're able to kind of learn processes and mitigate, and balance out pros and cons of any given situation. These are skill sets and ways of thinking that and cognitive processes that they learn over time. So we see a lot of risky behavior with adolescents. So these can include injury for some of the activities they engage in, legal consequences, pregnancy, infectious disease, substance use disorders. So we also know about mortality, morbidity, and social problems with adolescents. And so behaviors that contribute to unintentional injuries and violence, very similar to what I was just speaking to. We see tobacco use, we see alcohol and other substance use, sexual behaviors, unhealthy dietary behaviors. This is one of the things. We have very high prevalence of obesity within the youth population. And these days, especially because of the pandemic and social distancing and the limitations that have been put in what used to be considered a natural, what used to be considered normal for a lot of youth, for a lot of people in general, physical inactivity has really increased. So obesity is a huge challenge. But it's not just that, when you're physically active, it also is healthy for your mind. So it kind of one area overlaps in the other. These behaviors, as well as obesity, overweight, being overweight, asthma, they all intersect and frequently related. So they're established during childhood and adolescence and extended to adulthood. And it's almost like even cognitively, you think about how an individual, a young person starts to develop certain ways of thinking, certain ways of behaving, certain ways of dealing with things, and you build on those habits over time. So it's not too difficult to understand how, as adults, some folks have had certain behaviors all their lives. Most times, we see a lot of the unhealthy behaviors that have started in the younger years. Some of the behavioral challenges and the exercise of poor judgment, and that was really about thinking about how the midbrain, it's the emotional part of the brain that tends to lead off on how a young person may act. These are risk-taking opportunities that I spoke about. The emotional part and the impulsivity that comes with the emotionally charged brain, it has certain consequences. And sometimes, since young folks are still learning how to socially interact, they're not always as astute and picking up on cues. So sometimes there might be some misinterpretation, some miscommunication. One of the things we do know that sometimes they have a limited attention span. They have certainly often have a different concept of time, and there are inhibitions that they do lack. But that they like because they haven't had the experience or the learned behaviors yet, or the learned experience, the experiences that will help them learn what is healthy yet. So one of the things I wanted to speak about is the pandemic-related youth challenges. So thinking about how routines have changed quite a bit for our youth. So the changes in the regular routines, and in addition to everyday steps to prevent COVID and the social distancing guidelines, you know, it's um, it's one of the best tools we have to avoid being exposed and to the virus and getting infected, and it does slow down the spread. But the physical distance to folks you love, and your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your partner, your close friends in adolescent times, being amongst your peers, interacting with your peers is a really important part of development. So when you are keeping a distance from family members that you're used to be close to, or maybe your worship community, it can be pretty difficult. It can be very impacting and stressful for adolescents. So they may struggle with these social routines. The breaking continuity of learning. Unfortunately, the need for virtual learning environments, has brought to light a lot of inequity in resources. There are connectivity issues depending on the families. Although a lot of youth, we used to always think that technology is more prone to youth than it was to adults, but that can be very limiting as well. So if you have adolescents who were more athletic or hands-on or vocational skills, this potentially impacts that part of their life. Missing significant life events. So there are special life events that think about the high schoolers and during May and June who had achieved and were able to graduate but not celebrate, but not have a ceremony, not being able to wear the cap and gown with their peers. That's a heck of a milestone, and healthy and it's a wonderful marker for healthy development. And a lot of young folks were not able to do that. And there's other things too. Also consider that you don't necessarily celebrate this holidays or traditional, rituals that cultural or otherwise or society wise that, teenagers look forward to. So that's huge. The loss of security and safety. So in a lot of times it's economically based, so parents and families, a lot of folks a lot of folks have lost work, have lost employment. And so that has its own trickle effect on the teenagers and the family and the ability to do certain things. It could affect and has affected a lot of families in terms of access to healthy foods. Transportation and housing has been impacted. So these stressors mounting can increase exposure to violence, to substance use, to co-occurring disorders, or just mental illness. So some of the risk factors some of the mixed risk factors include that some of these teens you might see them have bouts of moodiness or episodes of crankiness, and sometimes these indicators may be the presence of something more serious going on. So being socially withdrawn, you might see the moodiness may last more than a few days. I've heard a lot of parents at different times say, they're just going through a change. I remember one young woman was every time she had a parent who her daughter was about 14 or 15 at the time, and she was one of these young people that was very much into school. She didn't really have problematic behavior. Her mother was my client, and her daughter had episodes of depression, and she had gone to therapy. She couldn't understand why she would just start crying at a drop of a dime. The mother thought that there was something going on, and really when they took her to a specialist, what they found is she has episodic depression, and the diagnosable kind, and she was prone to uh, keeping a lot of time away, spending time away and by herself, and also hiding her tears when she was emotional because she couldn't. So a little information actually helped her get through it. But since her mother started to give her like affirmations that she can connect with to help her through those times. But sometimes we have teenagers who go through situations like that. And instead of dismissing it, what we need to do is like assess it or find a way to engage the teenager to be able to assess, screen and assess and see if there are potential issues there to explore and address. So there are dramatic changes in eating. We spoke about that. Ongoing anger, irritability, and hopelessness. Yeah, consider just how hard it is, not just for adults, but you know, teenagers too have noticed how many folks have been affected by this pandemic. How many uh, people might get sick and may not survive, or people who get sick and have a very hard time with that. It's not. It's a very scary atmosphere, and so this is affecting our teenagers as well. So one of the things about mental illness with adolescents, like 50% of all-time cases of MI will develop by the age of 14 and 75% by the age of 24. And we know that the young adults go from 25 to 30, which is when the brain is fully developed. This is a huge percentage here. The most common mental health disorders are anxiety disorders, stress-related disorders, mood disorders, obsessive compulsive eating disorders, disruptive behavioral disorders. You know, and many times they go undiagnosed. So neglect and abuse has its own impact. Neglect disrupts attachment and it changes in the development of brain. Um, these can be these are extremely impacting. Many teenagers that are living with unresolved adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs, as we spoke about recently, such as living in, like, say, in a very poor area, extreme poverty, which a lot of families have started to experience in this last year with this COVID thing going on. And so being exposed to, say, partner violence or domestic violence, or other resources of stress, you know, they just experience a lot of anxiety. So escape is often like their coping mechanism. So it might make sense to a youngster to, when the anxiety triggers their fight or flight mode, that maybe an escape might be certain behaviors that might take them outside of themselves. Like sometimes we see the risky behaviors. Sometimes it's because of this. Sometimes we do see substance use because there is availability of the substances. So you can start to consider, maybe from an ecological perspective, that there are different influences and factors going on, and maybe being part of that teenagers' world at that time. A lack of empathy in terms of neglect and abuse creates frustration. Things that creates frustration and anger. Say our families who are trying to survive, and maybe the nurturing is not there, or it's not done, it's not provided in a healthy way, because adults get frustrated as well. So anxiety disorders, we know that up to 32% of 30 to 18-year-olds, you know, have feelings of excessive uneasiness, worry and fear, where they can get where we've received diagnosis. We can look at the data, and it shows that 32% have shown they meet the criteria of anxiety disorders. So it speaks to different emotional and social changes, certainly impacts their sleep. And we do know that adolescents, teenagers, and even young adolescents really can benefit from long hours of sleep, like 9 hours is considered healthy. But we see a lot of this in their work performance, and in terms of their attitudes in class, whether their homeworks that they do submit, their grades. Sometimes anxiety disorders can occur in panic attacks, and how we perceive that, it's really important. A panic attack might be perceived in a certain environment as, you know, an attitude problem, an anger management issue, and it's not necessarily so. Depression affects about 13% of these adolescents. And so to be diagnosed with depression, the symptoms must present for at least 2 weeks consecutively. So some of the symptoms may include being persistently sad, anxious, empty, being pessimistic or hopeless. There could be feelings of worthlessness, and this is extremely important, particularly around this age frame with adolescents, where they are they're very malleable at this time. They're psychologically, because they're trying to learn who they are, and they're trying to exist in a world that they are just learning their skills in. And if they're feeling worthless, this is going to impact just what they do, how they feel about themselves, how they interact with other folks. The loss of interest or pleasure in hobbies and activity, decreased energy, and fatigue. So others include attention hyperactivity deficit disorder, or what we refer to as ADHD. If you have experience with any of these situations, please share it and include it in the chat box. Eating disorders, ADHD, I will tell you that a lot of young folks do not either have this misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. There are a lot of people who have gone into adulthood with these symptoms of ADHD and had never had it addressed until later in life, but have found ways to build their resilience and live life despite the challenges, despite that they may not have known that ADHD was part of their world. So, and knowing that having specialists that are very proficient in terms of development issues and mental health related issues for adolescent and specific age range, it's really, really important in terms of diagnose. And an appropriate diagnosis was going to give the appropriate or the most accurate treatment recommendations. So either have eating disorders and co-occurring disorders. We also know about self-injury. Others, this thing about we find that we have learned, and the research has also shown that injuring self has been a way where some teenagers feel like they can feel like they can get relief when they feel pressures are building up inside of them. So trying to stop painful emotions or trying to distract from hopelessness. So there's another thing I wanted to bring up also is this Zoom fatigue. Have you folks heard of that? Isn't that interesting? We've heard it with adults, but we really have to put a lens out on the teenagers too. You teenagers, you have young adolescents, young kids. The education is coming through virtual platforms. They've had to kind of just get I hope you do what you got to do to take care of yourself. So, um, so I'm thinking about where a lot of teenagers are now. You've had to transition almost overnight from in-person activities and all the associated information that they have stored in the experiences that they've had, in terms of school and getting their education, to doing everything on a virtual platform. And everything associated with that is a drastic difference between one world and another. And when you're on a virtual platform consistently, it can be very, very draining. The data actually shows, and we try to incorporate this when we do presentations ourselves. And there are some of our trainings are actually like 6 hours and 12 hours requirements to provide CEUs for social work and for case acts. And so it's certain requirements of certain topics, and because it has certain content, and we have to be able to format it according to the data that we have. Research states that no one should be on a platform longer than 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours, and you have to have a break. Otherwise, the information does not get internalized as effectively. It's not as retained as it could be. And what you end up having is you have actual physical symptoms of being on virtual platforms all day. This is what the world is right now. So actually trying to mitigate that with your schedules is really key. So imagine for adolescents who've had to change from one world to a different world and still trying to kind of navigate through their own growth process without a lot of information. And so that's something that specialists like yourself, professionals like yourself, can inform families about, and maybe even provide certain maybe suggestions. So actually breaking up school assignments and school or times to be on an actual platform can be a very effective way of trying to actually maintaining their mental and their physical health, and still being able to help them adjust and be productive and retain some of this information. Let's see, bachelor's social work student. So yes, Zoom fatigue is very real. Burnout from technology is very real. Yes. So this is the thing about if you have to go to 3-hour training, like I do 3-hour trainings. Sometimes I have to do a 6-hour training, or I have to do facilitate a 12-hour training. I have to format it in such a way where you can't stay sitting in front of the monitor the whole time. And within 90 minutes, you have to have a break. I may do something for 2 hours, but then 2 hours is like the max I can take it, because I'm very concerned that anybody sitting in front of the monitor can't retain the information if you have them in front of it for 3, 4, 5 hours, no breaks. That doesn't make sense. So this world that we live in, and Zoom fatigue is very real. It makes it difficult to cope with the pandemic and stay connected to loved ones. But sometimes the change with who you're connecting with can be very different. But here's the thing. So if it's all work with kids, you want to think about how the education is coming. Being able to format it accordingly is really important. We have information on our ATTC website, or send me an email and I will send you the information that is relevant to like how long and what you can do to take care of yourself while you're in front of the Zoom, if you have no choices, if you have to be in front of it. With kids, you can help parents understand how they can regulate the schedule. Where they have a break, they actually step away and actually start to suggest that and recommend that they do other activities in between to kind of mitigate some of the impact of being on a virtual platform all week. It burns out folks, and when you're burned out and you have a mind that's still developing, the way a lot of our teenagers are, it can be so impacting. It could cause more irritability if there are existing issues that have yet to be identified, like some kind of mental health issue or substance use may be at an early stage of experimentation. This can actually exacerbate situations. So teen stress tends to be, and this is a really good way to put it, a pileup of many stressful life events. So even before the COVID, different events are dealt with very much from experience, with learned skills, right? For the most part. But for teens who don't have a lot of experience with dealing or having healthy coping skills, with dealing with stressful events, the breakup with a partner, getting a very, very low grade when you're used to getting you have a particular average, not making it to a school event, or think about what I mentioned before about some of our students, some of our graduates didn't have the opportunity to actually attend their graduation. So these things kind of build up on each other. If stress is in the family and conflicts is going on, there are issues with maintaining a job, issues with illness. All this can build up and really stress a teenager out. So we know about romances, we know about breakups, but we have to consider that there are other issues. The environment outside is really impacting everyone, but it's certainly impacting on a teenager who has less opportunity to have been around to develop a lot of healthy coping skills. So family issues or problems with parents, school-related problems, their own thoughts and feelings, and this is the one that I think is the most important, is their own thoughts and feelings about what's going on in the world right now. And seeing people one day, maybe not seeing them again, having to deal with loss and grieving, watching it not just from a distance, but actually up close. And if you're from New York, it would be very rare if you didn't know someone or have a family member, a close friend, or someone that you know that did not transpire from having gotten sick with COVID. But we weren't always putting too much attention or light to teenagers and how it impacts them. So just imagine, what this might be doing with them. So that kind of build up, it's like, I think a little bit about cumulative trauma and how that builds over time without being resolved, and how that can lead to substance use or co-occurring disorders. And so this can have an impact right now in their lives. see, recently someone referred to stress as stress Jenga. Yes, because the pile up and trying to build up with what builds up in the mind. And with Jenga, one piece is missing and like the whole thing couples down. So there's a moment where it can all kind of fall apart. So some of these things are important for us to remember in terms of how we interact with our adolescents, because the stress and how they deal with life in the situations that they are experiencing, just like we are, they deal with it slightly different. Doesn't mean that they're not resilient, that they can't. It's just that a lot of teenagers may not have had learned the healthy processes when they have other risk factors in their lives that may be extremely difficult. So risk assessments that are recommended today are like the rapid assessment, the RAPS. So it's for preventive services. It's a risk screening tool recommended by the Society for Adolescent and Health and Medicine. One that I think that a lot of folks are using, and a lot of organizations specifically focus with adolescents, is the Child Adolescent Needs and Strengths risk assessment. Multi-purpose tool. It supports us a care planning process, and it helps inform decision making and levels of care, and to provide quality improvement initiatives and resource matching, and to help monitor outcomes of services and build successful outcomes for teenagers. Very teenager focused. And the thing about needs and strengths, and one of the things that we always speak about, my colleagues Paul and Mary always speak about it, about person-centered process. And this is really speaking to the needs and strengths of the adolescents, because this is what you can build resiliency within them, and help them to understand and learn how to mitigate their world. So here's a question for you folks. 6 out of 10 young people believe that the casual use of electronic cigarette does no or little harm. What do you think about that? It does no harm. True. Absolutely true. Yep. That's what they believe. 10%. I'm pretty surprised to hear that. I definitely think it does harm. I'm with you. So this define casual use. You also don't see it as smoking. This is true. You know what? There's a perspective. Think about perspective here. Does a ton of harm more so than regular cigarettes? It has a lot to do when we overdo anything. It has a lot to do with chronic use. It's horrible long-term consequences of use. Yes, thank you. So it has a lot to do with casual use. How often is casual use? It's like saying define normal. So it depends on the individual. How often do they casually believe they are vaping? Using these electronic cigarettes. And so it depends on the youth. Actually 6 out of 10, this is a true statement. And so 10% of US young people believe that e-cigarettes do not cause harm. And a lot of times, when I was saying perspective, a lot of times when we think about, it says no harm, is because it's associated with, initially they were associated with a good way to stop smoking cigarettes, right? And so that is part of the perspective. But that's also similar to saying, well, a lot of people don't think alcohol causes that much harm because it's legal. It's a perspective, but it's not necessarily informed. So 62% believe that they cause little or some harm. Maybe 28%, only 28% of youth do, according to this study, believe that they do a lot of damage when used some days, but not every day. So it's interesting. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. I think part of this is that there's not consistent messages, PDSAs, for the public. So the use of e-cigarettes in February of 2020. So we know that there were a total of more than 2,800 hospitalizations associated with e-cigarettes and lung injury. And remember, there was a time where we were hearing every once in a while someone was dying from lung injury, and doctors were bewildered. They were not able to identify direct causes. I remember one of the last kids that in the Bronx. I know his family. They're very close to us, and I went to that funeral. And it was just we were still at a place where scientists are still not. They can identify certain things that probably caused harm and may have led to death, but it's changing so much that they still don't have conclusive, a lot of conclusive information. And so deaths in the U.S. related to vaping have even trickled into Puerto Rico. And so we know that kids that come from Puerto Rico that come over here, and kids who are here in the United States who are still engaging in this, at least one thing I can say is that the e-cigarette use has not increased, but it hasn't decreased either. It's been pretty stable. Among diseases in the U.S., 78% developed in people under the age of 35. With an average age of 24, a lot of this is just speaking to habits that start at an early time. So how does an e-cigarette work? Well, they create an aerosol. And I should have put this in English. They create an aerosol. This is the compartment here on the left side. And this is the battery part. And that creates that helps create a vapor that is inhaled by this other side on here, the tip of the mouth. And so, and there's this, under the tip of the mouth here, there's this component where an e-liquid can be inserted. And so you have e-cigarettes, vaporizers, hookahs. And so vaping is just the act of inhaling. And what you see here is a couple of kids who actually are just showing how that's done. The device is really small. As you can tell, like see in the first picture, actually in the second one as well, in the first picture, it just looks like a pen. So it's not like it's easily observable. You can easily identify it. So the actual device is it's just battery powered, and that's the heat, heats up the e-liquid, and then it's inhaled. And so the steam is inhaled. And so it comes in a variety of flavors, and that's where with a lot of different unidentified chemicals. And this is part of what starts to affect the lungs. And this is where research has been somewhat limited. There's not a lot of conclusivity, and when it comes to the different of the potential of different substances that are found in these liquids. There's a wide range of options that are used with e-cigarettes, and there are a wide range of devices. So in addition to inhaling nicotine, they can actually contain a lot of the harmful ingredients. So some of them are ultrafine particles that inhale deep into the lungs. So you can't necessarily see, you won't see it with the human eye, but these are actual real particles, that they don't break down, and they end up hitting the lungs. So some of the flares, such as diacetyl or chemical related to serious lung disease, has been identified. There are heavy metals such as nickel, tin, and lead. There are different organic compounds that can be that can produce very heavy chemical impact. Vitamin E acetate has also been part of the bronchoalveolar wash liquid samples that have been used or identified in lung injury. So some of the caramel flavors, here's what you see is some of the different ways that that these flavors are packaged. And look, and it's packaged and marketed in a particular way because it's marketing and targeting the youth population. So, and these flavors can be menthol, have alcohol, candy, fruit, chocolate. They can be sweet, so they can mask a lot of different or chemical substances that are so harmful. So tobacco, the use of tobacco accounts for 80% of preventable deaths in the U.S. 23% high school students use e-cigarettes. Young people who use e-cigarettes may be more likely to smoke regular cigarettes in the future. And that's what some of the data is showing. But since the rates have not increased and we're in this pandemic, some of the research is limited, but I am looking forward to seeing, just in what direction, how much more we've evolved in terms of identifying, patterns of behavior. Because even though this is prevalent right now, what I will say is that there are interventions that exist where we can obstruct those trajectories into that can impact later adulthood. So some more of the consequences that could be part of a conversation that we might have with our youth is the other things that comes from smoking, the bad breath, the smelly clothes, especially if you're not supposed to smoke and your family's not supposed to know it. A person who smokes on a regular, and I used to smoke, I was so desensitized to the smell that I would not necessarily smell it on my own clothing, but anyone else could who doesn't smoke, they could easily pick up on that. And so the same idea, same concept can apply with adolescents, where, you know, the clothes can be smelly, they smoke a lot. Parents, it might be a part of how conflict occurs. So it certainly has other physical adverse consequences. It's very hard to keep up with sports because your breathing is labored, your breathing is impacted, increased risk of injury or shorter healing time when you are sick, risk of disease. Um, chronic chronic smoking is also associated with bronchitis and pneumonia. And so that's things to consider. Some other things to also talk about is marijuana. And in the 60s and 70s, this is interesting. I think most of us know this, but just to cover it anyway. So there is another perspective that teenagers have, that marijuana is not a harmful drug. It's a natural drug. It comes from a natural plant. You know, it comes from a plant, so it's a natural product. So it's not harmful. It doesn't mean that someone's going to end up being, you know, injecting drugs later on. The reality is that it does have its own, within its own context. Marijuana is very different than what it used to be. So between the 60s and 70s, the psychoactive substance in marijuana is THC. And between the 60s and 70s, THC concentrations were pretty low at that time. But that has changed quite a bit. Now they are almost like 20%. So this slide highlights the idea that growers that develop methods to make marijuana much more potent yet have actually succeeded in doing that. And think about the fact that we are legalizing marijuana almost across the country. You know, Colorado was one of the first states to do that. New York and New Jersey are both legalizing it. I believe they're both legalizing. I know in New Jersey, they legalized it. In New York, they legalized it for medical use. I think they're working for recreational use. In New Jersey, it is legal for recreational use, not just medicinal reasons. But the information that comes with it, it's really important to share with the teenagers. Most recent research shows that marijuana has become that much more potent. Some studies show up to 30% more potent than what it used to be, and that the use has, you know, has been on the rise. You know, it's just been increasing over time. And though some perception that it's harmless is based on ideas of this from many years ago, even many years ago, it did have its consequences. You know, folks who, especially teenagers who may be having, say, stresses and symptoms of situational or might be from maybe some psychological issues that come from mental health illnesses. You know, sometimes they deal with the moment by maybe wanting an escape. So maybe smoking a bong or smoking a joint might be what's going to give them relief in the moment. And being in the moment is something very, very much associated with adolescents between 14, 15, and 16 years of age. And so, and also in light of lacking other healthier options or ways to process, you know, it can provide immediate relief. But it's the trajectory to chronic use that puts them at risk. So the perceptions, of course, is that it's included here, but most marijuana use begins in adolescence. So 78% of folks who smoke in adulthood have started in their adolescent years. They were between 12 and 20. Every day, more than 3,200 teens, almost 3,300 teens use marijuana for the first time. So the brain changes with the development process. Since the brain is still developing, it's very slow in developing when chronic marijuana use is part of their world. So regular heavy marijuana use can actually really depress the IQ, the potential IQ of a teenager into adulthood. I can even down to up to 8 points, which I think is like super interesting that they can that's drastic enough to be able to identify that. So early use of substances, 9 out of 10 people use nicotine or alcohol or any other substance before 18 are at risk of substance use disorder. And if you hear some of the experts that work in the treatment field and addiction disciplines, you'll find that they've been in the field so long and know the research so well. And what I understand is that from 90 to 92% of folks who have a substance use disorder in adulthood started before they were 18. So each year that substance use is delayed during the adolescent brain development period, the risk of substance use decreases. That's extremely important. So interventions or certain strategies to use will be very key here. And I also want to associate substance use with trauma. 1 in 4 children and adolescents experience at least one potentially traumatic event or some kind of adverse experience before they're 16 years of age. And so that in turn occurs and creates the vulnerability, vulnerability to slowing down development. 1 of 5 adolescents between 12 and 17 have been involved in some kind of abusive or dependent, or problematic use of illicit substances or alcohol. And again, I want to think about how potentially risk factors, exist in their world. In surveys of adolescents receiving substance use disorder treatment, more than 70% of them have a history of trauma exposure. Huge, huge to think about. We have been trained and we are using trauma-informed care with adults. We are encouraged to do the same when we're working with adolescents. So I have a case here. This is a true story. I had borrowed this from one of the articles I read. And so Luka, Luka is the name of this young person who was Luka's case, Kennedy Luka. He says, she says, I was selling my clothes. She was a 15-year-old in high school. She'd buy shoes, she'd sell them, go out, buy cheap shoes, sell them. She was doing everything she can to get money. Luka knew that that the vaping habit was out of their control. This is what they got caught up in, and they became addicted to vaping and the different flavored substances. And so he was spending up to $150 a week. The habit was really bad. So Luka's from North Carolina, so ended up going to a 40-day rehabilitation agents process in North Carolina to help quit the e-cigarettes, and it was fueled by nicotine initially, and then nicotine with other substances, with other, the flavored liquids. And sometimes, you can also put marijuana and opium in these vaping devices. And so Luka had gotten to the point at 15 years of age through vaping that going through a lot of the behaviors to help keep up with the habit. So signs, what are some of the signs that you want to look for? Well, find, sometimes you have unusual items. Vaping devices come in pieces very, very often. And so sometimes you'll see the, detached pieces here and there. You might see, because you folks will work a lot with the adolescents and teenagers or families of. So what you may see as maybe some devices that they may have readily accessible on them in a pocket or something. And it may not necessarily be a pen. It may not necessarily be a storage unit like a USB flash drive. It might actually be a vaping device. But you also want to consider, behavioral changes. What are the type of mood swings? Something unusual to their pattern. If they're not usually agitated, but now they're more regularly agitated, that might be something to note. These are different red flags to consider. They might have difficulty breathing, and this will be maybe an otherwise healthy young person that you had always known. Want to think about, their performance in school. Sometimes they have sweet fragrances, and that's what some of those candy flavored, liquids are. They smell nice. Weight loss, mouth sores, abnormal coughs. That's certainly a red sign. So things about clinical care, you want to make sure that is culturally appropriate? Do you want to take an approach that's trauma informed? Stating clearly what you're doing, it's important. I'm sorry, that's an incomplete sentence there. Use a person-centered approach. That's always important. I talked about a couple of days ago about being able to engage in a conversation with a young person, but in talking with them as opposed to at them. It's really being about eliciting from them information. We would do more and learn more and be able to be more effective when we listen more. The information that we elicit from an adolescent or a teenager is more informative in how we can go forward than as opposed to us being more directive. And so really understanding how their world is from their perspective, what they believe they see, and then actually putting these details together. That's a huge part, not just building a rapport, but coming to an accurate assessment or an accurate as possible assessment. So help support them where they're at and learning to listen to them. So 5 tips that sometimes we can share with parents that teenagers can do is just know the facts. Actually providing information so they can so adolescent teenagers can make informed choices is huge. I remember when teenagers, a couple of teenagers tell me this, they don't understand why they don't get certain information in school. And so I have this thing that I used to tell my daughter, some information that was relevant to her age group, and I would share it with my colleagues and my friends. So because they had young kids that they worked with or had at home, and so it's amazingly different, the attitude from a teenager when you give them information that has to do with them. It's not personal, it's more science-based, and just let them know and get them involved in their own wellness. So there are plenty of resources available online through a lot of different health organizations that can help adolescents and parents and professionals just stay up to date with facts about vaping, and just and see about people of any age can give up vaping and smoking, unless they won't do it unless they want to. But experts say, but there's interventions that you can use for that, and I'll talk to you about how expert can help. But there are approaches that you can use to help provide information where an individual may want to consider, changing, addressing their behavior. So form a support system. Experts say that people who are more likely to quit using nicotine products are other people that look like them and act like them who are also engaged in the same process. And there's a ton of different apps. And apps are, I think I think maybe adults who were not privy before COVID were the ones who had the learning curve in terms of getting up to date in terms of how to use technology. A lot of teenagers are more apt to use it more uninhibitedly, a lot easier. So there are readily accessible apps that can be informative for teenagers. So, and maybe consider, suggesting counseling. There are health experts that recommend that adolescents seek counseling or therapy to address nicotine use, as well as maybe other underlying problems that, may have been the causatory factors in the first place. So what we see a lot of times, this is a diagram that I use in some of my presentations when it comes to using expert academic impact of substance use. In the school setting is one of the places where we can see whether what issues may be presenting, or where we can see that there may be issues presenting that we need to identify and address, or be able to speak to a particular teenager for something. So sometimes there are times where individual factors, from an individual perspective, you look at a substance use and how it may lead to academic failure, or how one can lead to substance use. So, are there a lack of resources? How's the bonding with teachers? Is there some type of disengagement from school? Are there some neurological, some mental health issues here? Impulsivity, attention problems, the deviant peer affiliation. Peership is really important during adolescence. Who are the peers that they're around? Is there parental monitoring and supervision at home? And this is not a judgment call. A lot of parents are trying to keep a job, trying to maintain a roof over their head and food on the table. It's a matter of knowing whether that nurturing is coming, is that support coming for the teenager or not? Because we can do things too. We can actually access resources and provide opportunities for our teenagers to be able to get what they can't get at home. We can help complement that or fill that gap, rather. Parental permissiveness regarding substance use. We have seen in the last 5 years, we have seen in treatment, in a lot of treatment programs, we've seen that their family members, parents and or uncles and aunts, and there are generations in the substance use disorder treatment systems. So there may be, or is there, it's worth finding out, is there an idea that, substance use is normalized there? So these type of factors can lead to, what we may see as academic failure before someone escalates in substance use, before they drop out. If we see patterns early on, we can intervene and actually change the trajectory. So signs of substance use include, alcohol, smoking, other chemical odors in your child's or friend's breath and clothing. Being dizzy, weird behavior, things are weird because it's not normal for that young person. Are their grooming styles? Is that changing? The choice of friends changing? Who they're hanging out, where they're hanging out? Is that changing? Is there more irritability and more conflict at the home? Are they eating more, sleeping less? Is there weight gain or loss? Weight loss a lot of times is a big can be a big red flag with young folks, but weight gain also, because a lot of times when teenagers are going through a lot of stressors, sometimes an acting out process to cope may be eating more than what they normally do. So you kind of have like both sides of that same coin there. So it's a school problem, failing grades. I just showed you a chart of how, sometimes you can see that their traditional pattern in school and involvement in school and outcomes in school are changing drastically. Is there trauma or frequent injuries, runaway, delinquent behavior, depression? Is there mood talk? Is there talk about suicide and such? Important things to think about. So adolescent substance use disorder and domain level factors, so it could be individual. So there are different overlapping issues that you may want to assess, that you may need to assess for. So it can be genetics, early childhood temperament, or have there been any kind of mental health symptoms or disorders in the family or in them. Traumatic exposures, which is not always something that most people are aware of or adolescents will be aware of. Many practitioners will interview the adolescent, but will also interview parents to get both perspectives to try to get an accurate picture of what may be going on with the adolescent. So family and parents, is there family dysfunction? The parenting relationship, how's that going? Is there substance use? Other issues related to supporting or normalizing substance use, or siblings using drugs. What's the environment like? Is there are there antisocial peers that they're engaging in? Is there pressure? What's the media promotion? I always think about what media does in terms of impacting everybody, just everybody generally, but because teenagers are still developing, so that can be so much more impactful at a younger age. So what's the availability, access to alcohol and other substances? What about violence in the community? All of these risk factors can actually start to outline a particular world that any given teen might be living from. So what I wanted to discuss here, and I think this would be helpful for you all, is principles of adolescent care. And adolescents are, developing, both physically, cognitively, emotionally, and socially, and they're different from from the younger children and adults. So make sure that that the care that you're matching them with, or the care that you're providing them, it's appropriate to their development stage, and also include their assess for their cognitive and the psychological well-being. Understand if there's mental health issues, depression is part of it. Also do not forget, when we do assessments, we have to consider the current landscape. So we have COVID on one side, we have an oppressive atmosphere, and we have folks with people of color. So understand that this is impactful to our teenagers as well. So make sure that the care is culturally and gender competent or affirming, was probably or informed, which is probably better terms. So it should be respectful or racial and ethnic or sexual orientation or gender identity, despite age group or especially because of age group, and understand their geographic location, where they come. Have they always been a resident where they're at? Is there a history where they migrated from another place? Think about the adolescents' interactions in other systems can actually afford an opportunity to link them to substance use disorder services if it's appropriate. So collaborating among adolescent serving agencies is huge. Understand who are your partners in the community. Think about integrated care and how that could be very comprehensive in addressing co-occurring mental health disorders and primary care services. A lot of primary care settings are using these types of approaches in mental health settings and addiction settings, where in prevention and recovery support services, we can also incorporate these concepts. Trauma-informed care is I already spoke about that. This is something we should always be doing. Recovery-oriented systems of care for adolescents emphasizes that the importance of the adolescent guided and family-centered care. And so really a person-centered approach. And it's really about thinking about, it's a little different than what we traditionally think about in terms of addiction. Instead of addiction, it's recovery-oriented. And what I suggest with recovery-oriented systems of care is it's not so much that you want to have a teenager and go through the eligibility criteria and the admitting orientation process and do all the assessments in the beginning and then give them a treatment plan, and then put them into your programs. Just look about individualizing care. Really look at what support systems and structures do you already have in place, and instead of fitting the adolescent into your programs, fit the programs to your adolescents. That's a recovery-oriented approach. Also, think about evidence-based practice that are specific for adolescents. And I'll show you a few options are being used today. We have evolved quite a bit in our disciplines and in care. We are no longer using dumbed down versions of adult evidence-based practices very specific to adolescents have been used. And so it's really important, and especially when I'm saying about recovery-oriented approaches, really important that it be tailored to the adolescent and their needs. So best practices, this is one of the more recent publications on adolescent substance use disorder best practices guide. I've included the link to this PDF of this manual. Anything that is from last year is the most current information I'd rather give you. And so if this is available now, you want to look at that and see how this is working, how this is being implemented, or are these services being implemented or provided in your area, in your region, whether you're in New York, New Jersey, or another state, wherever. So these are, this is a really nice array of approaches and strategies to use. So here I want to talk about and take a few minutes just to talk about screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. And for you folks in the chat box, I'm going to ask you folks, who has heard of this before? Screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. Who's heard this? If you've heard it, yes. Just type in yes in the chat box. I just want to see whether you're familiar with it. Yes. Okay, great. How many of you folks, excellent. How many of you folks are actually using this and using this with adolescents? Okay. So for years, okay, familiar. Okay. So for years, we have been using SBIRT. That's just a short version of screening, brief intervention, referral treatment. It's an evidence-based practice. For years, we have been using it with adults in a variety of different disciplines. It's evidence-based. First started to be, it was first researched and duplicated in a variety of different settings and included as an evidence-based practice within healthcare. And then it started to be implemented in different settings. And so it has really taken off. And that was with adults. Well, what we've been seeing and we've been connecting right now is a best practice for use with adolescents. It's a wonderful way to intervene before someone actually meets the criteria of substance use disorder. So what is made up? Thank you, folks. Thanks for everybody for your responses. So what I wanted to show you here, these three components is not as literal as it seems here. Just want to make sure we're clear on this, and come to one of my presentations on screening, brief intervention, referral treatment, and you could get more information on this on the actual practice. It's a screen. It has these three components. In context, it is evidence-based when those three components are in place and facilitated, conducted exactly the way it's designed. So screening is a reset of questions that identify risk of substance use related problems. Now, and it uses validated instruments. And so brief interventions is just a person-centered, it's got a motivational interviewing spirit in the approach, in the dialogue. So it's a short guidance or counseling that raises awareness of risk and motive. And what it does, it elicits information from the person and helps them to see or recognize a potential problem. And really it's about motivating them to consider whether or not they may want to do something about their problem without being directed at any point, at any level. Brief intervention here really means brief intervention. It can be done within a matter of 15, 20, maybe 25 minutes. It's just short conversation. It's a dialogue, but it's very strategic with this MI skills that it uses. It's not complicated, really. Short treatment can be just cognitive behavioral work with clients who recognize risk and are seeking help. And risk is a word that you're seeing here quite often now. What this whole expert is really about addressing and intervening with folks at an at-risk level, which often is the case with teenagers. You know, they are using at a level where they may be experiencing or putting themselves at risk for consequences. And so we can still be able to intervene before they might need treatment. And so the last part, the referral treatment, is actually, because this is really building off of screening, this whole approach, this whole intervention model. It's really referral treatment. It's really about being able to, if someone scores high enough, to be able to provide them access for further assessment, because we don't diagnose folks with SBIRT. But if they need specialized treatments, they can also get that. So screening, brief intervention, referral treatment, or SBIRT, actually helps to identify and intervene with folks at risk, with teenagers at risk, and can also help identify and address the issues with those who might have a high likelihood of a substance use disorder. And screening as SBIRT has also been used very much as being used with other issues. I've trained some folks from a treatment facility, and one of the addiction professionals started to use SBIRT to address other behaviors like the smoking and some other risky behaviors that their clients was engaged in. The substance use was already being taken care of because they met the criteria, but he decided to use SBIRT to address other behavior that needed modification, and it was helping him. So we can actually use this model with fidelity and actually apply it to other issues. The idea is substance use related problems, at-risk issues, and it could be an issue of depression. It could be an issue of certain behaviors, but we know that it works and is validated with substance use. So SBIRT for adolescents is a person-centered approach. And when it comes to, it's a good fit for teenagers because it is person-centered, because it's not about forcing anybody, it's not forcing any teenagers, it's really trying to meet them where they're at. So you work with the youth where they're at. So it allows them to develop their own action-oriented goals, or what they might think that they can do. They're the most realistic, they're the ones who can come up with the most realistic options, so that's a nice, neat thing about SBIRT. It's a commitment to lengthy and intensive interventions that can be difficult at this age. So a brief intervention is typically one session, 15, 20 minutes. And it has a rapport building component to it, and a particular dialogue that is more person-centered and more of a friendly conversation than it is any kind of directive with an adult talking to an adolescent or a teenager. And so it has opportunities for a lot of information, a lot of engagement. So many youth are seen in opportunistic settings. So what would be one of those opportunistic settings? What do you think that would be? What do you think we might be able to, what do you think we can actually practice something like an SBIRT process? So when I say opportunistic settings, what are we talking about? Yes, school. Excellent. school. And I would tell you that New Jersey has legislation that requires schools to consider the three components of how to include screening, brief intervention, referral, treatment. And some places are actually using ESPERT. In New York, it's being piloted in different places, but there's no legislation, but it is being sought out. So we have school, yes, emergency room visits, mental health clinics. Mental health clinics is such a key part. Will be such a key aspect of care. When you're doing intake and you're assessing, especially when because substance use, the impact of substance use on folks can actually mimic symptoms of mental health issues. This is an opportunity to be able to intervene and address this issue, and then have a more accurate assessment for the mental health issues. So pediatricians, that's exactly right. Yes, you will get the slides. So intake for home-based or community-based services, so recovery support services. This can be applied in so many different areas. You have some some boys and girls clubs. You have different community based initiatives that teenagers like to go to. You have opportunities for this when you are engaging in conversation with a school guidance counselor, with a coach. There's opportunities here and there, and even today in today's pandemic. Thank you, everyone. That was really good. So some validated screening instruments that are used. This is for the craft. I like to talk about the craft too. It's an updated version of the craft because this craft tool has a short screener and has, it asks about how many days has someone been using, has someone used alcohol, marijuana, or other substances. And it has, and it doesn't target how much have you used. It's not a directive approach, but it's a really neat way to kind of continue, start off with that conversation with the youth. You also have, alcohol screening for ages 9 to 18. You have the S2BI, which is an intervention tool specific for youth, and also the brief screener for alcohol, tobacco, and other substances. So you have validated instruments, and this is just a few of them. There's much more. So one of the things I would tell you, and that can help you, that can really help in initiating rapport with an adolescent, is when we explain what confidentiality is about. They're more likely to more likely to be forthcoming with you if you can explain to them, what's confidential. So confidentiality typically, involves you're not going to share the information with anyone else unless there's an issue of them hurting themselves or someone else. But actually explaining to an adolescent the context, specifically the context of confidentiality when they speak with you, can help them feel like, okay, they can say something to you and trust you with it. And so adolescents answer confidential screenings more accurately when you do that. So that's what this is all research based. So state and national laws allow minors to receive confidential care related to sexual health, mental health, and substance use disorder treatment. A lot of times, if it's substance use disorder is part of their world and their issues to address, most times, it's not a secret. It is already known. And if they need specialized care, actual treatment, of course, it's probably the parents' insurance they will use. But there's a lot of times where it's not about a substance use disorder. It's more about substance use that's impacting their lives, whether they're able to see it or not, and you're able to do that with them. Confidentiality also provides an atmosphere that you can create to be culturally sensitive, to be affirming and inclusive, to be trauma informed. And all of those align together really well. And the more you can do that, and don't be afraid to be human. So this is the craft too. It really provides you an idea of what it is, of what those questions are like. So it's really more about, it's very self-explanatory. You ask these questions. If you drink more than a few sips of beer, wine, or any drink containing alcohol, it's either a 1 or a 0. This one, the craft tool also has more updated questions like, is there use of any marijuana? For example, weed, oil, hash. I mean, it actually gets more specific, like K2 or spice. And you ask these questions and you put a 1 or a 0 at the end. If there are no days of use, then you stop right there. That's it. That's the mini screener. You don't have to do anything. But if there's any days of use, then you ask the other questions, and I'll show them to you now. One of the key factors of being more person-centered is when you do ask questions, and this works really well with teenagers, is ask them if it's okay if you can ask them some questions related to substance use. Don't just drop it on them or force them or be directive in a way that they have to answer because you are the adult authority in the room, but actually ask them, would it be okay? That makes such a difference to initiating a rapport. So craft two, if there are any days of use, these are the questions you would ask to follow up. Do you ever use alcohol or drugs to relax or better feel about yourself or fit in? Or alcohol or drugs, while you're by yourself or alone? Do you ever forget things while things that you did while using alcohol or drugs? Do your family or friends ever tell you that you should cut down on your drinking or drug use? Have you ever gotten into trouble while you were using alcohol or drugs? And so this is a way to assess the level of risk or substance use that they're using. And so if there's any adolescent using medication, because prescription medication is still being used, you want to understand, you want to find out what is the medication and ask pro for that. Actually explore and ask that specific question. What are they taking? So let me ask you quick. I still got a couple minutes, so I want to ask you something. So confidentiality is important to provide a safe space where a teenager will feel comfortable enough to be more forthcoming, to respond to questions that you may ask. So you want to ask some permission if they can ask. So here I have two young women, two young girls who are filling out one of these self-report screeners. What do you think? How do you feel about that environment and the fact that they're filling out a substance use disorder screener, one of these craft two screeners? So what do you think? What do you think about that environment? What's your opinion? Looks nice and calm to you? How safe is that space? No privacy. There you go. So they are together, exactly. So what you want to do is sometimes some agencies have had either a certain section of their facility where they either have electronic screeners, so they can film it, but in places where they're by themselves. These two young girls are together. There's no privacy. That can actually influence the responses they can give. I want to show you another one. What about this one? These are older folks, but look at, but this gentleman in the yellow tie is actually a principal of the school. If that gentleman was really one of the, say, a 10th grader, it's not very viable. It's not very viable. It's not very feasible. It's not conducive to a safe space. So when a teenager, or just like anybody else, if you're not in a safe space, how likely are you to respond to very intimate questions? And asking about substance use is intimate. So I see that, they can share information, intimidating. They might share information. They might influence each other's answers going forward. Yeah, there's no way, that's no privacy enough. Yes, thank you so much. That's true. So safe space, no privacy at all. Right. And this seems like it's out in the hallway. So think about, they won't answer, they might shut down. See, here's the thing. So if the screener is the very thing that justifies having a dialogue, a brief intervention. And if you don't set the atmosphere for a trusting, safe, and private environment, just like confidentiality might incite, a level of trust. And the person, you want to have a physical space, not just the psychological space, but a physical space that is also conducive, so you can elicit information that is likely to be more accurate, that you can build off on. So that was good. So the brief intervention really speaks to building a rapport and weighing out pros and cons and providing information and feedback. All throughout this process, you're asking information, you're summarizing back, you use the readiness ruler, and you develop an action plan. This whole thing takes 15 to 20 minutes, 20 minutes average. It could give or take a few minutes. And so, and the more you do it, the more natural the conversation goes. And this is all about eliciting information. It's all person-centered. It all comes from where the teenager is at the time. So substance use screening for adolescents can be self-administered by computer or by paper, or the clinician can do the verbal interview themselves. I would suggest letting them self-report first, because I think that depending on your environment, that might be the most conducive manner for then when you get to see the teenager, you're able to take that screening result and then work from there. That incites the conversation. So I wanted to show you here, there are adolescent-specific therapies that are used in practice. These are some of them. There are the CBTs, the group therapy or peer support programs. There's contingency management. Let's see. Motivational enhancement therapy, which was really actually developed and built off of motivational interviewing, and 12-step facilitation therapy. A lot of my colleagues who are therapists use a lot of family-based therapeutic approaches. And the idea here is because family is usually the staple in an adolescent's life. And so brief strategic family therapy is actually a therapy that invites the family members to also be part of the therapeutic process for the adolescent, and helps to, incite healthier, support, communication and support systems, family behavior therapy, functional family therapy, MST, must-have systemic therapy. A lot of that gets done in juvenile drug court or problem-solving courts for young adults and adolescents. So these are been seen very highly effective. And then if they need treatment, there are treatments out there. There's medication for opioid use disorders, and medication for alcohol use disorder. These days, we don't call it MAT, or we call it MOUD. Even nicotine use disorder, there are medications that are used, may be appropriate. It really depends on the person and an assessment done by the clinician. And then you have your support services. You have mutual groups and peer support groups, recovery high schools. These are all very supportive in terms of with other youth, that helps them all kind of bond together and kind of share a certain direction of wellness, recovery wellness, where they're beheaded in. I wanted to share with you that these are resources that will be helpful for you. I think this will be these resources and these slides can provide you an array of different information. There is more information specific to the pandemic that is coming out these days. The CDC is a really good site for that. But you also have, in New York, you also have Health and Human Services. Department of Health has a whole section on adolescent. Different states have that. And so they are collecting a lot more data within the last 12 months, a lot more than I have ever seen come out so rapidly. Part of my background is based is on research, and I have never seen research come out as quickly as it has been during this pandemic situation that we're all trying to continue to survive in. And so there's a lot of relevant information that you may want to access for your teenagers that can help you in your disciplines, in your practices.